Good morning, everybody. So let's just jump right to the historical preservation, which is even more what he was most proud of. As I mentioned, his mother had really drilled family history and the importance of history and preserving the history into him. In 1924, my grandfather walked into Mayor of Baltimore, Mayor Jackson's office, literally as he had a pen up ready to sign a demolition order for the Baltimore Shot Tower. Are any of you familiar with the Shot Tower? I think it was the last one left in the country. At one time, it was supposed to be the tallest structure in the United States.
What were these shot towers?
A shot tower is how you made lead shot for muskets and guns.
And you needed a tower?
Because what they would do is they would take molten lead up to the top of the tower and they would drop little bits of it and it would form a spear. As it dropped, it would then hit water at the bottom that would immediately harden it, and that's how shot was made back then.
So they had to get all that up to the top.
Right. How they did that, I'm not quite sure, but it's a fascinating structure, and of course my grandfather thought, you can't tear down history. The plan was to tear down in 1924 to put up a gas station. Because gasoline cars were becoming a little more well-known. So he immediately told the mayor, stop, give me a couple weeks. And my grandfather went out and formed a group and wrote, from what he said, literally almost 1,000 letters personally himself, and was able to get the money to buy the tower, and then presented the tower that organization gave the tower to Baltimore. So literally, that's why it's still here.
It is still here?
It
is still there?
Oh, very much so. It's neat. I drove by the other day. It's sort of northeast of the harbor. So it's a few blocks north of Little Italy. So it's an area of Baltimore that some people don't go into, but fascinating structure. My grandfather also got very interested in the constellation. At that time, of course, I know you're familiar with that in Baltimore Harbor. At that time, they thought the Constellation was one of the original 6 warships built by the U.S. Navy, right about the time of the Revolution. And at that point, Rhode Island had the ship. So my grandfather got into extensive negotiations over many, many years to get the ship transferred back to Baltimore. And he was able to do that.
Was it built in Baltimore?
Yes. Yes. And about that time, Howard Chappell, who was a naval historian, did some research and found out that the ship was actually not one of the original ones. It had actually been sort of taken apart and rebuilt. It was still an early warship, so it's not what my grandfather thought it was. And my grandfather, till the day he died, never accepted Howard Chappell's research, and my grandfather was wrong. But then my grandfather was, even though he had a history background, Howard Chappell had the real detailed knowledge and research. So that was another thing that's here because George Radcliffe decided to go out and get it. When he was out of the Senate, he got involved with an Arthur Houghton, had a place up near, a prominent landowner up near Wyoming. And they got Maryland Historical Society and the Society of Historical Antiquities to undergo an Eastern Shore survey. And their goal was to preserve all the historic structures on the Eastern Shore. And they hired a crew, and I think they found about 200 buildings that were built before the year 1800. I know the Third Haven Meeting House. Am I saying that right? I know that was one of them, and I know there are a couple in Talbot, and there's certainly a couple in Dorchester. And then he set about getting them preserved. In Dorchester County, Old Trinity is the oldest church in the state of Maryland. It had completely fallen into disrepute. So we made that project number one. And there was no money for it. So my grandfather, having been a United States Senator, had connections. He also had one or two wealthy distant cousins that he went to. But he went to the Garbish family. Mrs. Garbish was a Chrysler. Actually, they were living in Dorchester County. And within 1 week, he had the $100,000 to completely rebuild the church. So Old Trinity, that was his first restoration project. About the same time, there's another old building. Well, there's a Christ Church down on Taylor's Island that was actually built by his grandfather. And he started putting money in to preserve that, not so much because it was part of the historical survey, but because it was, his family had built it. But he discovered that the oldest schoolhouse in Taylor's Island still existed, and that was on the historical survey. And that was a barn on somebody's property. So he started a foundation, which has done an incredible amount of restoration in the Taylor's Island area, some in the Hooker's Island area, and Lower Dorchester. But their first project was to move this Chapel of Ease. Back then, if you were more than 5 miles away from a church, that was considered too far to travel to church in a day. So what they would do is build a chapel called a Chapel of Ease that was which was a very simple structure, much more centrally located. And the chapel, which had then became a lot of things, that chapel was built on Taylor's Island. So
Christ Church in Houston has a chapel in St. Michael's.
right.
Oh, no, not Christ Church, the Catholic Church.
Right. So they made it so that everybody would be within 5 miles of a church, which on horseback, or, that's still a long way to go for a round trip to go to church. He used history to somehow create attention for things. When he was trying to draw attention to this whole project that once again needed money and attention, he found out that Taylor's Island actually played a prominent part in Maryland history. William Penn owned Pennsylvania, and Delaware, of course, was part of Pennsylvania at that time. And basically, Lord Baltimore and William Penn were arguing about where the dividing line should be between the two states. So what they decided on is that they would put a point equidistant between the ocean and the bay. The question became, is Taylor's Island part of the mainland? And if Taylor's Island was not a part of the mainland, then obviously the dividing line would be further east and Maryland would be a larger state. And after a long battle between the two of them, it was finally decided that Taylor's Island would not be considered part of it. Would be considered part of it. So the dividing line was moved further west and Maryland became smaller than it should have been. My grandfather played that up in the 50s and literally made it a major statewide thing, and he used that to draw attention back to this Chapel of Ease. So he was always good at manipulating and using history to kind of get things preserved. Personally, he did some amazing restoration. You'll actually see a tiny bit of this when we do the tour. His mother's ancestral home was on Taylor's Island, and in 1925 was in danger of, because of shoreline erosion, dropping into the bay. So he put it on a barge and moved it up the Little Choptank River, and my wife and I now live in that house.
Which one?
The one on the left. So we actually.
It must be very cold at night.
And it's.
I bet they would be laughing.
Okay. if you remember me talking about the woman who went out and went to the British frigate and freed the Taylor's Island residents and her husband, she was the one that lived in that house. So it's kind of neat. We get to live in a historic house. His father had built a school, and we'll talk about that more when we do the tour. And when it stopped being used as a public school, because it was his father's building and he wanted it preserved, he had it moved onto the property, and that's now on the windmill property. And we'll actually be in there in a couple of weeks. So we'll talk about that more when we get there. His whole life was about doing this. His very last historical preservation project, when he was 10 years old, his father's windmill blew down. Shipbuilders, being a shipbuilder, he was more than qualified to build windmills. And when you look at the roof of a windmill, it's very much the same construction as the hull of a boat. It's like an upside down boat on top of a building. And I'll talk a lot more about the windmill when we get there, otherwise you'll get to hear everything twice. But when he was 10 years old and the mill blew down, he got the millstones and the steps as a 10-year-old and got them moved to a barn and told his mother that he would rebuild the windmill. And at age 93, he decided it was time to do it. And he was able to secure a boat builder. And a lot of this, there's a fascinating story behind it, but I'll tell some of that when we do the tour. But it was actually the windmill, which is operational. It will be operational again once we get the blades put back on. You won't see it in operation. As a matter of fact, you won't see it even with the blades on it when you tour. Those blades that you see right there.
Do you take them down to renovate or?
It's over 50 years old now, and it just needs some major maintenance. So, but it was dedicated on his 95th birthday. And he was as happy as a little school kid. He was able to actually fulfill the promise that he made to, his mother. And I could go on and on and on and on and on with all the things that he was involved in. He was a fascinating man. This is a typical day out of his diary. Started in Washington, went to Baltimore, went to Annapolis, went to Washington, went to Baltimore. You can read what it's for. Had a couple things at Baltimore. Spent, actually this is 2 days. Spent 3 hours answering letters. He claimed to have answered every letter that he was ever written as a United States Senator. I have the carbon copies of the letters that he sent, and I can vouch for the fact that the man literally probably wrote 50 to 100,000 letters in his Senate career. It's just unbelievable. I mean, a kid would write it and he'd answer it with a one-page letter. Now, he dictated it and a secretary typed it. He then left. He then left Baltimore for meetings in New York. Came back to Baltimore to meet with the mayor. Then ended up Washington for a Senate committee. They came back to Baltimore for a dinner meeting, and then back in the office answering letters again. This is at age mid-60s. Yeah. And every day of his life was he was.
George, what mode of travel?
He had, and actually I don't have this in here. In the book, there's a chapter called Bull Turtles, Jim Lee's, and it talks about he found, my grandfather never learned how to drive. He tried to drive once and it was a disaster. If you read the book, my father remembers it and tells the story. So he hired a waterman, retired waterman from Dorchester County to drive him, and he drove him his entire life and ended up becoming by far his closest friend in life, and just a.
I've been.
I met the man on numerous occasions, no education whatsoever, completely slaughtered the King's English, but and here he's conversing with one of the most highly educated men, and they just got along beautifully. They just. It was a joy to watch him, and
From Annapolis to Washington. it has to take an hour or more.
Well, traffic, of course, we didn't.
There was no traffic, and I drove with the Swain Foxwell was the gentleman's name. Swain did not pay attention to speed limits.
Okay.
I have firsthand evidence of that. We literally, my wife and I went out to dinner once with my grandfather. Swain was driving. I'm not exaggerating when I say both my wife and I got down on the floor in the back seat. We figured we had a better chance of living. So there is no doubt in my mind that Swain could have made that deadline. And yes, the roads were worse, but there was a lot less traffic. But just phenomenal work ethic, which, and it's,
Well, maybe, while he was in the car, although that would have been a bumpy ride, he could have been doing reading or.
I'm sure he was reading, but they would also
4
talk.
hours. Yeah.
They would talk. They were completely different, and yet they found a common ground for conversation. And
Sure.
even though my grandfather could sit there and talk with a PhD, he also could talk with just a local person. He would show interest in them and
Just like you,
and get them to talk about what they're doing. And Swain, once again, it's a chapter in the book. Swain was a character. He really was a true gentleman. He never aspired to political life. Always, many times I heard him say politicians should be seen and not heard. Always told jokes on himself, and just you see the quote down here when he passed. Sam Hopkins, who was a key figure in the Maryland Historical Society, if you can read that, he just I never heard my grandfather once in his entire life, and I was around it for years, say anything negative about anybody. Never once. If somebody would make him mad, he'd just, oh my, and it just, I don't have the degree of patience that he had, but he really did, and Christmas was a major deal for him, and he had the largest private collection of books on Christmas in the country. If you remember back to what we said, Christmas would play a major part. He was always in demand as a speaker on Christmas. A lot of his at Christmas season, he was always booked because he would tell stories. He would tie history into it. His most significant speech in the United States Senate was on Christmas, and it was the 1 year anniversary of Pearl Harbor, and he asked the Senate if he could give a speech that was really more of a college lecture. And my grandfather's speeches probably would have been boring to people in the Senate because they were more history lectures, and he would tie in bits of history and whatnot. They put him off until the last day that they recessed before Christmas, and I think I've got the speech in the book. It was fascinating. Basically putting what Hitler was doing in Europe in the context of history, and feeling based in the context of history, his hope for how things would play out, and somehow tying Christmas into it. One of the things historically that was kind of neat is a lot of times if there was a war going on, there would be peace declared for one way, and there would be no fighting on Christmas Day. And that sort of inspired my grandfather, without going into details. Anyway, so his speech is put off until the last day. He's in the Senate office. He gets a call from I think Alvin Barkley was in charge of the Senate that day, and he calls my grandfather and says, "Where are you? We're recessing in 15 minutes." So my grandfather's in the Senate office building, which is not close to the U.S. Capitol. Fortunately, being a runner, but once again, he's older. He literally sprints over there. Just as Barkley's about to drop the gravel, my grandfather goes busting in the door, papers flying, trips and falls, manages, and then gets up and gives this long speech. I can only imagine what the senators were doing, they all had to be looking at their watch, saying, what in the world are we doing? I want to go home. But he was very, very, very proud of that speech, and he actually turned it into a Christmas card, and it actually resurfaced on many occasions. But Christmas was a big deal for him.
So just hold it. Marie, can you hear okay?
Oh,
Where your mute is, so I can't hear you. So thumbs up if you can hear.
I can hear it fine.
okay, great.
All right, thanks.
Wonderful to see you.
I'm sorry I'm late.
Oh, no. He every year he designed and made his own Christmas cards. And they were not really Christmas cards, they were holiday cards because he had a large number of Jewish friends. And we'll talk about the Jewish connection in a second. And so they were more holiday readings, but they were historically based. I mean, basically he's talking about the history behind the flowers in that picture, the flowers that he had planted. They were just very unique, and we've got a bunch of them. They're really kind of neat. He always made sure that because our family, my father being his only child, we weren't living down where he grew up in Dorchester, that he literally recreated a Dorchester County Christmas in Baltimore. So he would literally bring Christmas trees, holly, bayberry, pine, turkeys, oysters, you name it. It became a highlight of our Christmas because Christmas would literally show up. Sometimes this is later on, it's a pickup truck. It used to be a full-blown farming, grain truck that would show up literally full of stuff. But Christmas was an amazing deal for him. Stayed active. Okay, this is him running in his 80s on top of the Fidelity and Deposit Building. It was important for him to stay active. This is actually from the Baltimore Sun. Couldn't believe that an 80-year-old man was still keeping up. And he went to work every day, worked out in the gym every day. I'm sure in early 90s that wasn't much of a workout. Very much of a family man. And of course, this is a man that I knew. He never once talked about politics unless you really bugged him. It was all about family. He was very much of a genealogist. He knew his relation to everybody. He would introduce you, this is your third cousin twice removed, which of course meant nothing to, a young kid, but he would just keep everybody up to date. He would write long letters to family members. And there are a few things in the book where he just really went beyond with family normally with what somebody would do. That's him with my brother. He loved being a grandfather, I think, more than anything, and I just have such wonderful memories of him. He really was a Santa Claus for our family, no question of that. Everybody called him Cousin George, hence the name of the book. In 1962, he decided to celebrate the 300th anniversary of Spocott. So he invited his family. 500 people showed up. I was in charge of parking that day. I was told to get spaces for 150 people.
Did you get tips?
No. And literally, it was just unbelievable. And it was because he was really beloved by that generation. He was kind, he was interested in family. Like I said, he stayed connected to everybody. And I remember that day. That was quite a day. And he stayed on his feet, walking and talking for about 9 or 10 hours. When he was 90 years old, he was robbed. He was in the Fidelity and Deposit Baltimore, and this is probably why he didn't live to be 100. He was working alone on a Saturday. He often went down and worked at weekends, even at age 90. And two people came in wanted him to open the safe. He refused to open the safe, and they mugged him, beat him, broke his hip. Really was badly beaten, and the most tragic thing is they stole his watch. I remember me saying that was it, and that killed his spirit. We all noticed the difference. 67 was the year I graduated from high school. So being in college the next couple of years, I saw a little less of him, but particularly from my father. My father was worried about him because he just the spirit wasn't there. But then it started coming back. He started to rebound from that. He stayed active to the very end. He's buried in Cambridge, and shortly before he died, Johns Hopkins had a ceremony for him. And because he'd been one of their amazing alumni, you're talking about how this, I mean, he literally was at every reunion. He was so involved in the college, and they presented him with another watch. And what my father just said, it just really brought him back to life. But anyway, that's his personal life, and we're going to actually jump. I've got a quote here. I think this quote's on the book. This really sums my grandfather up. You know, George Radcliffe, his methods are odd. You sometimes think he will never come through, but give enough time, let him do it in his way, and he will move the pyramids from Egypt to Hill Park. And that's really characterized him. He wasn't flashy. He was certainly probably one of the lesser known United States senators because he wasn't out getting the attention. He was just quietly working behind the scenes. He literally could make just about anything happen. I mean, he would, you know, he would get windmills built, constellations moved, shot towers saved, and just whatever project he got involved in, it might take him some time, but he would find the money. He would set up the organization structure and pull it off. The Maryland Historical Society would not be what it is today without the work that he invested in that.
One thing, there were a lot of things that were very touching to me last week. One of them was, and I kept thinking about it, was when you were perhaps giving a talk at the Maryland Historical Society to younger people, and they were clueless about your grandfather. That must have stung.
Me?
Yeah, I mean.
No, because having been in education and dealt with enough people, and we don't have the continuity with the past that we used to have. There's certainly plenty of people that are passionately interested in history and whatnot, but people tended to stay in their own communities. People weren't going and getting a job across the country. Communities tended to stay more the same. So there was more continuity between the past and the present. And we've lost a lot of that because, for example, I don't live in Cambridge. I live outside of Cambridge. Nothing against Cambridge, but I prefer not to even have to go to Cambridge. It's kind of like, we have to go to Baltimore, oh dear. And yeah, I love Baltimore, but Cambridge is a completely different city or town than it was, even when I first moved into Dorchester County. There's so much of a turnover. And in the big cities, there's even more of a turnover. And without that continuity to the past, a lot of the people that were prevalent and important really have been forgotten. We tend to focus more on the most recent people. And I wouldn't have bothered him because what he cared about was family. And family never forgot him. And still has not forgotten him, the few that remain. No, I wouldn't bother him at all. But he was very unorthodox in the way that he went about things. I listened to him speak many, many, many times. He was not the best public speaker. He was an interesting public speaker in terms of what he would talk about, but he wasn't colorful or flamboyant. It was a college lecture that was just, and I can imagine sitting, United States Senator sitting and listening to him, you would think, please finish so we could go on to business. So anyway, let's go on to his political life, which is kind of interesting, and that's part two.
Justin? It might be easier.
So let's go.
We gotta do it from here. Some serious place.
That's what I'm always afraid of too.
Part two. Good. This part I present, even though it's not the most important thing to him, because he was prevalent during a really fascinating time in history. 1935 to 1947, a lot happened. That's the end of the Depression. That's Roosevelt and all the ABC programs, the beginnings of Social Security and all that stuff, and of course the war. And there is one thing in here that is, I think I mentioned this, there is one thing in here that he never bragged about. But I've talked to several prominent people, over time that just said it was one of those little unsung things that made an incredible difference, and you'll see that in a second. His political life started, of all things, he was a commissioner in the Baltimore Liquor Commission, which is hysterical because my grandfather didn't drink. And he got roped into it by his old high school principal, Emerson Harrington, who was governor at the time. So my grandfather said he actually learned a lot of politics from this because he was always dealing with saloon owners and whatnot and just avoiding conflict. Because the moment you walk into a saloon, you're immediately the enemy. And he would always go in with a bottle of liquor, which is funny considering he didn't drink. And he would negotiate with them and was able to do it very peacefully, very successful. But his commission ended because of something called prohibition. And he saw that coming, and he never really voiced an opinion about prohibition. I think he was happy about it because he got out of this job. Probably.
Is that him?
No, that's the governor.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's Governor Harrington. So anyway, once he got out of that, Governor Harrington said, "Oh, not so fast. We're going to tie you into something else." And actually, this started before. Because my grandfather was so adept at history and incredible at record keeping and whatnot, they made him chairman of the World War I Records Committee. They wanted to come up with a sort of an almanac of every Marylander that had ever fought in World War I, with dates and units and all of that. And my grandfather set about doing that. He would actually end up doing the same thing for World War II when he was president of the Maryland Historical Society. He's doing this when he has a full-time job with Fidelity Deposit and when he's also a United States Senator. This is where he's just taking on more work than anyone would do. But he was very successful with that. And once he was no longer liquor commissioner, Harrington said, "Okay, I need a Secretary of State," because the Secretary of State had to step down. So he became Maryland Secretary of State for 1 year. Once again, he refused to give up his job at the Fidelity Deposit Company, and he stayed on with that full time. And that was a full-time job because that was not only working in the Baltimore office, that was doing a lot of traveling around the state. Talk about that in a second. Once again, back to this key year, 1921, the connection with Roosevelt. And of course, we talked about Roosevelt, but having Roosevelt as a very close friend would obviously set the stage for my grandfather to go higher up in the political hierarchy. They visited each other on many occasions. There are a couple stories in the book about my grandfather driving around with Roosevelt up in Hyde Park, which is interesting because Roosevelt had polio, my grandfather couldn't drive. So the two of them would get in the car and Roosevelt would drive. And my grandfather talked on multiple occasions of ending up in ditches. Just it's sort of hard to imagine the two of them careening through it's not the way we picture Roosevelt historically. Probably not recorded in the history, but my grandfather recorded. Roosevelt also visited on Spocott on at least one occasion. I'm assuming he was there several times. And very, very close friendship, and that would, bloom into things. Roosevelt, my grandfather made many visits to Hyde Park, and I talked to him. I really didn't ask him questions about this really till later in life. Unfortunately, it just occurred to me, your grandfather's connected with all these people, and all you know about him is the fact that he loves Christmas and loves family, and I really need to find out. So he would talk about his trips to Hyde Park, to visit the Roosevelts, and he said pretty much it always played out the same. He said, they would have this wonderful family dinner, and at the end of the dinner, Eleanor would go off to do her thing, and Franklin and my grandfather would go into a study with the kids, and they'd be climbing all over Roosevelt's lap, and he would, they would read stories and tell stories, and my grandfather just loved the fact that Roosevelt was so much of a family man. He was very annoyed that Eleanor did not spend the time with the kids, and my grandfather did not have a good relationship with Eleanor Roosevelt, and I suspect a lot of it came from this. He admired her as a woman, but he felt that she didn't, and this may be a little bit of a sexist attitude, didn't feel like she devoted enough time to the kids. And the friction between the two of them got to such a point that when Roosevelt died, my grandfather wasn't even invited to the funeral, which is interesting because of all the US senators, he was by far the closest to Roosevelt, and yet he was one of the senators that wasn't invited. I don't know whether he ever was upset by that, because I never, in his diary, in his notes, in his letter, there's never any word of being annoyed. He just sort of accepted it. That's kind of the way that he did things. But
Where is Hyde Park?
it's up the Hudson River. It's about an hour and a half north of New York City. It's a beautiful estate, and
Is it in Rye, New York, or?
no.
I just don't know.
I don't know. It's closer to Poughkeepsie than anything.
Yeah, maybe, yeah, that makes sense.
I've been there, and I should know
Right.
where it may actually be in Hyde Park. I don't know if there's an actual town that's associated with it. I should remember, and I don't. But it's just some wonderful, and their friendship really grew throughout the time. They took a lot of trips together. There's one trip in particular where the two of them spent almost an entire spring traveling around the Midwest trying to develop business for the Fidelity and Deposit Company. Once again, Roosevelt had been hired to be the vice president in charge of the New York office. My grandfather was basically in charge of the Baltimore office. They traveled together, and there was a lot of political talk in that. And even though I don't know the details of that, I have to suspect that the stage may have been set for my grandfather thinking beyond. Certainly, my grandfather, at that point, Al Smith, was stepping down as governor of New York to run for president, and my grandfather was one of the ones that talked Roosevelt into running. And I suspect a lot of that happened on this trip, because Roosevelt announced fairly soon after this trip that he would run for governor of New York, which of course he was successful in that bid. My grandfather was also getting very close and connected to Governor Albert Ritchie, Maryland governor for 4 terms. My grandfather ran all of his inaugural campaigns, and that's something my grandfather was very good at organizing events. And if you look at so many things he's doing, they were this inauguration or this commemoration or the whatnot anniversary of this event. And he very much was pushing Albert Ritchie to run for president in 1932. And he was considered one of the strong contenders for that until Franklin decided he would run. Then my grandfather's torn. He's got his best friend, and he's got this man he supported all the years, and he thought the world of Roosevelt, and thought he had a much better chance of being elected than Ritchie. And so he immediately threw his hat into ring as Roosevelt's campaign chairman. Was his campaign chairman in the 1932 election. he had numerous conversations because Roosevelt debated running. He'd only been governor for one term, and he was not popular in some areas. He was very unpopular, for example, in the state of Maryland. Maryland would have just gone for Ritchie in a heartbeat. But my grandfather really pushed him into it. And then he became his Maryland campaign manager. But he was really more than that because he was in, even though he coordinated things in Maryland, which of course was kind of a key state since that was the state Roosevelt was projected to lose. But there were numerous meetings up in New York and Hyde Park where basically he was in on some of the higher level political strategy. FDR was not popular in Maryland, but with my grandfather running the campaign, Roosevelt went from being unpopular to soundly winning Maryland in the election. So now with Roosevelt as president, it's very clear that he's going to ask his friend to do something. The first thing that my grandfather was asked to do was to be the undersecretary of the Treasury, because obviously that fit my grandfather's banking, insurance, financial background. My grandfather didn't want to do it because, once again, he was committed to working at the Fidelity Deposit full-time. Roosevelt next asked him to be head of the Regional Public Works Administration for the East Coast. Basically from Kentucky, Tennessee, all the way up through the entire East Coast. My grandfather said, no way. It's a full-time job. I'm committed to the Fidelity Deposit. I'm not going to do it. So Roosevelt said, okay. I mean, they argued and argued and argued. This is really well documented in my grandfather's letters and notes. So Roosevelt said, okay, I understand that you don't want to take the job, but how about coming over to the White House and having coffee or breakfast with me in the morning? And my grandfather, because they were friends, he would frequently go by the White House. So my grandfather showed up in the White House and walked in the room. There is Roosevelt and the press, and Roosevelt introduces him as the Regional Public Works Administrator. With the press there, my grandfather couldn't say no. So he took on the job and still worked full time with the Fidelity Deposit. He negotiated to have the PWA office set up in Baltimore in his office. He said that will save money for the federal government, and that way my grandfather could sit in the office and do full-time jobs.
Walk across the hall.
He, once again, being an incredibly good organizer, he set up an administrative structure that made the program incredibly successful. I mean, anything from the Tennessee Valley Association, all of those major projects basically were started under his administration. Roosevelt was so impressed with the administrative structure and that basically they, in a lot of the alphabet organizations, they use that same administrative structure. And that was getting my grandfather a lot of attention and a lot of positive notoriety. Once again, like I said, he kept a full schedule. The Choptank River Bridge was one of his things. If you remember, we're talking about Dorchester County being very isolated and getting a bridge. So my grandfather wanted two bridges. He wanted the bridge across the Choptank, but he also wanted the bridge across the Chesapeake Bay. And in 1935, literally in his first year, he started pushing for the Bay Bridge. The Choptank River Bridge had been funded under the PWA when he was administrator, but it wasn't officially dedicated until he was actually in the Senate. And when I look at this picture, this is a picture of Roosevelt's yacht going through the Choptank River Bridge. What you can't see in the photograph and the story that I heard, and there actually is a better picture of this, but it's copyrighted and I couldn't use it for the book, so I had to use something that was a little less impressive. What you can't see is my grandmother standing on the edge of the bridge, watching the whole thing, and ended up absolutely furious at my grandfather because he never once waved at her as the yacht went through. What the yacht's a Sequoia. It was actually in Cambridge a while back.
You can see little figures at the end.
Right, yeah, you can. The reason my grandfather didn't wave is because Roosevelt decided he wanted to stand on the front of the Sequoia, and of course, being, with polio, standing was difficulty. And this is on a boat in the water. So my grandfather had to have one arm on him and one hand on his belt to hold Roosevelt up so that he would not go into the drain. As he said later, I didn't want to be the first person to throw a United States president overboard into the water. But he used to chuckle about that story.
Is this the, what's now the fishing pier from
Now the
that side?
fishing pier.
I was unaware that had a rotating type draw.
Right. And it was named the Emerson Harrington Bridge, which would
I
make sense
remember that.
because of that
I was
connection.
unaware of the draw. and that-
Yes,
That draw worked until the
right,
present bridge was built.
true. And that draw is now right below where it is right now. They took dynamite and blew it up, and it's now an oyster reef.
Yeah.
I guess you could scuba dive. If you could see anything, you go down and see it.
Well, that's the first time I've heard you talking about his wife, and I've been very curious about her role in all this, but especially.
I'll talk a
looking at
little
this
bit more about her at one point here. Actually, it's coming right up, but she's a whole chapter, and I could talk for an hour and a half about her because she was different. She was different. A wonderful grandmother, but I think there's one little bit of history of the Senate where I've got her in here. At this point, you notice 1934, George files for governor, not senator. There was a major rift in the Democratic Party at that time. Mayor Jackson wanted to run against Governor. No, they didn't want to run against each other, but they each had a faction of the party, and they were basically at war with each other. Ritchie decided to run for the Senate, and Jackson was then going to run for governor, which would have infuriated that whole section of the Democratic Party. So the Democratic, some cooler heads in the Democratic Party thought, let's run somebody completely non-controversial for governor and appease both sides. So they talked, and Roosevelt was behind this also, talked my grandfather into running for governor. And he announced for governor, set up a complete campaign. And like I said, Roosevelt actually called him to the White House to really pressure him. And once again, my grandfather he didn't want anything else because he wanted to work full time with the Fidelity and Deposit. So he said, no, I could be public works administrator, but governor, I got to be in Annapolis. That's certainly not going to work. But Roosevelt, who could talk the hide off of any animal, apparently talked him into it. He announced that he would run in June, and then all of a sudden, Ritchie decided not to run for Senate, that he was going to run for a fifth term as governor. And here's my grandfather running against his friend Albert Ritchie. So my grandfather, being the complete gentleman, said, well, that's fine. Now I don't have to run for governor. So he stepped down. He even there's his campaign brochure, The Man for Governor, George Radcliffe. And then Roosevelt pulled him back in and said, you're going to run for Senate. And he was pressured into it. And he just took the brochure and changed the cover, and it was the same brochure, and changed his whole campaign, had the campaign in place, and he resurrected the campaign. And once again, he was not well known because he was quiet and unassuming, but his record, his connection with Roosevelt meant something because Maryland was a little more positive with Roosevelt, but also, his accomplishments in the state were definitely working to his benefit. The primary election, he clearly won. I just put this up there for fun. I'm having trouble reading it myself, but he absolutely won handily. Interestingly enough, Richie obviously won the primary, but then in the general election,
Excuse me.
my grandfather won and Richie lost, which was sort of surprising. So Richie, who could have been elected easily United States Senator, or probably pretty easily, and my grandfather won quite handily against a former Joseph France, there was a Jacob France. Joseph France had actually been a United States Senator before, so he was kind of pulling a Donald Trump's, be out of office for a while and then run again. And my grandfather won fairly handily, not by a landslide. And now all of a sudden he is suddenly Maryland's junior senator. He was supposed to be, and this made national press. I think this is a clipping from California, where suddenly they realized Roosevelt has gotten his friend. Roosevelt now has a right-hand man in there, somebody that's going to be the yes man, do everything that Roosevelt said, and that's kind of the way my grandfather was built. And they thought somewhat the same politically, but as you're going to see, it didn't quite go the way that people thought here, because my grandfather had a different way of looking at things. At the same day my grandfather was sworn in, a senator was sworn in from Missouri, Harry Truman. And there's a photo down there of my grandfather and Harry Truman on a hunting trip with Vice President Garner. That terrifies me. My grandfather never learned how to turn on a radio or TV in his life. He was the most unmechanical person I've ever seen. And there he is holding a gun. I don't think he ever held a gun other than that one time. And there's some funny stories associated with that hunting trip. But he and Truman became very, very close friends. They were very similar. They both came from very strong family backgrounds. They both were farm boys. And they both were passionate about history and genealogy. As a matter of fact, when Truman was president, he actually asked my grandfather, one of the things my grandfather did for Truman, my grandfather was out of the office at this point. Truman asked my grandfather to actually work on his family tree. And my grandfather spent a lot of time trying to put together Harry Truman's family tree. Actually found that Harry had a Maryland ancestor, which Truman was thrilled with. But they were very, very close. Unlike my grandfather's relationship with Eleanor Roosevelt, he had a wonderful relationship with Bess Truman. And even when Harry Truman died, my grandfather and Bess continued to write until the very end. Very close friendship, very different kind of friendship than with Roosevelt. It's interesting, whoever put my grandfather on Senate committees was a genius, because they literally hit the nail right on the head. He was put on the Commerce Committee, Banking and Currency. Considering his background working with Fidelity and Deposit Company, that's perfect. The Library Committee. I mean, my grandfather, nobody read more books than my grandfather. And of course, that oversaw the Library of Congress, and Archibald MacLeish became the head of the secretary or the head of the Library of Congress. They became close friends, and my grandfather pulled him into Baltimore, or he pulled him into Maryland Historical Society often for talks. A finance committee made sense, and immigration, and with the shipping, my grandfather's shipping background, you're going to see that that really tied him into what he really became known for.
Do we still have an immigration committee? I have a committee that doesn't get anything done.
Oh, big time.
Yeah.
They're, in fact,
Well, for years, they haven't been able to get anything.
well, the foreign service, I'm gonna try and get a speaker.
Oh, that, yeah, I know, that'd be great.
But of course, there were so many of these alphabet programs that were starting up, and my grandfather's administrative experience with PWA made him, quite, qualified for that. He didn't play a major role in the Social Security bill. A lot of the work on that had been done before he came in. But in his first year in, that was the issue that really tied up all the time. My grandfather very much supported that. It's interesting because my grandfather had worked in the insurance industry. Obviously, that would automatically make him very fiscally conservative, which didn't really set with a lot of what was happening with the New Deal programs where they were spending money like there was no tomorrow. But my grandfather felt that in a national emergency, government intervention was warranted. And of course, that made Roosevelt very happy. You're going to see that's going to change. He and Roosevelt almost immediately got into a major disagreement. I don't understand all the ins and outs of this, but FDR was trying to put through the Public Utility Holding Bill, which basically gave the government the right to control utility holding companies, and actually something called the death sentence, where the government could basically shut a utility company down under certain circumstances. My grandfather really drew the line right there because he felt that was an overreach of government, what the government should be doing. And he and Roosevelt, for the first time, probably had some pretty good arguments. And that's sort of the beginning of what would eventually play out.
Is that term utility holding company talking about finance or talking about, power companies and those kind of utilities?
Finance. The finance. You're talking to someone who, the one thing you'll notice if you read the book, I don't deal with a lot of the finance issues. It's just beyond my level of expertise. And I kept, when I was writing the book, I kept telling my wife, I said, I can't believe I'm going to leave this out, but I wasn't qualified to do it, and I noticed the basic ins and outs.
Yeah.
The key thing here is that for the first time, my grandfather thought, that's the government overreaching, and you're going to see that plays in a little bit further on. The one thing, and this is where my grandfather came to life, he was appointed to the Merchant Marine Subcommittee. The Commerce Committee has two subcommittees, or did then. One was aviation and one was Merchant Marine. And of course, the Merchant, we'll talk about the Merchant Marine a little bit. He ended up becoming chairman of that. And this is where his passion for history kicked in because his father had been a shipbuilder. So he was right back, in his love of ships and whatnot. And he did something that almost no U.S. senator would do. I mean, now if a senator needs background information, they send their staff out and they come back with reports. My grandfather did all the research himself. Remember, he's still doing a full-time job with the Fidelity Deposit Company while all of this is happening in the Senate. That's why the back and forth between Baltimore and Washington, they must have burned ruts into the Baltimore-Washington Parkway. It's the only thing I could figure. But my grandfather did all of the research himself and actually put out, it was never published, but put out a pretty authoritative research history of the American Merchant Marine. And he sort of used that as a basis for what he would come up with. The one thing that he found was we really could have been stuck in a bad way during World War I. Because when the war started, we were almost completely dependent upon foreign shipping, which war involving other countries because potential disaster. By the time they got the shipping up and running, before the first ship was actually launched, the war was over. So it was kind of a joke. So what did the U.S. do? They then sold all of their ships and went back to completely dependent upon foreign shipping. And my grandfather saw this and saw this as a disaster. He said, at this point, it wasn't just issues with Germany. 1935, Hitler, of course, was really on the warpath. Italy had invaded Ethiopia. There was unrest in Greece and Turkey, and of course, China and Japan were close to leading to another war. Clearly, he saw a world war coming, and we are completely dependent upon foreign shipping, which would have been a disaster. Basically what I just said right here. We had no ships. There were only 6 shipyards. They were all on the Northeast. So with the war in the Pacific, that would have been a disaster. He saw that. And of course, virtually all of the shipping was done by foreign-owned ships. It wasn't paying for us to be able to produce a ship. It was obviously cheaper to use foreign shipping. Sounds a little bit like some of the issues we deal with today. But once again, we're a long way away from the war, but he clearly saw this coming. Even the ships that we own were mostly manned by foreign crews. So that would have been a problem. And he basically recognized that there would have been no way to move troops if we really would have been stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Well, the merchant marine is separate and distinct from the Navy.
Yes, it is.
Merchant marine is what's supplying your troops. And one thing I read a number of things from my grandfather. This is pretty well documented in history. A lot of wars aren't lost on the battlefield. They're lost because you can't supply your troops. Napoleon invading Russia is a classic example. Napoleon may have had the most incredible army in the world, but if you can't get food and supplies to your troops, you're going to lose the war, as they did. The inability to get not just transporting supplies, but in many cases transporting the troops. Because if your ships are already over there, you've got to keep moving troops back and forth. You're talking about moving food, munitions, everything that you need, vehicles, not just to Europe, but across to, of course, a lot of it, the Pacific operation was based in Hawaii at the time. So he authored the Merchant Marine Act of 1936. There was a House version of this. And interestingly enough, the House, the gentleman, I should remember his name and I don't. The gentleman in the House that the bills were going through the House and the Senate at the same time. And the two of them, my grandfather and the House representative, basically had almost identical policies, and they were able to get it through. But the gentleman that put through the House bill is the one that got the credit, and my grandfather didn't. He didn't care. He just got the bill through the Senate, but he was able to get through the Senate. What it did is it provided subsidies for U.S. shipbuilding. So for the first time, it would be just as cheap to build a ship as to use a foreign ship. They began constructing shipyards on the Gulf and the Pacific coast so that we were spreading that out. And it ensured that 90% of the crews had to be U.S. citizens. It did a lot more than that. It also established the Maritime Commission, which was, established the Maritime Commission. Roosevelt signed it into law, and it put in motion a major escalation of shipbuilding so that before the war started, we were mass producing ships. The complete opposite of what happened with World War I.
Is this the same bill that is in some ways tying things up today, that you have to have an American-built ship, American-owned with an American crew. You remember after one of the hurricanes in Puerto Rico, there was a ship right offshore in Puerto Rico. They were desperate for fuel, diesel fuel, and it couldn't land because of that bill. Somebody finally got accepted.
It was a foreign,
Right.
it was a foreign.
It was a foreign ship,
Right,
and
exactly.
it didn't meet those
Right, right.
requirements. And that's not that was one of the big examples of a hang-up.
Yeah, and that's a good point. I actually never thought of that connection.
Yeah.
But,
There have been other hang-ups. I didn't know if it was the same bill or if it was something subsequent.
yeah,
but-
no, my grandfather was extremely proud of this. He never said a word about this until I asked him a question. And the reason I asked him the question, when I was a senior in high school, I was in Gilman School in Baltimore, and we were supposed to do a historical research project with primarily firsthand sources. I think I started the book with this, and I'm sitting there at the dinner table saying, how the heck am I going to do something? Where am I going to find firsthand sources? And I just remember my father just like shaking his head, like, you know, the apple not only fell out of the tree, but it got destroyed. And this went on for a couple of days, and he never said a word, to my father's credit. And finally, I'm sitting there one day, and I said, oh, my grandfather was in the Senate, wasn't he? Duh. I said, yes, maybe I have a source. And I actually ended up doing it on this particular bill. And I'm so glad I had that project, because what I did is every I think it was Monday or Tuesday, I would go down to his home for about 2 hours and just ask him questions. And I recorded it on tape. And I just remember he had always been my grandfather, and he suddenly became a United States Senator. When he starts throwing out names like Roosevelt, Truman, Churchill, all the other people that I think, oh my God, I'm reading about all these people in history. I just recorded all of these tapes. My parents threw them all away. When I went to college, they went in my room and threw this away. Even worse, they threw my teddy bears away. I never forgave them for that. And even though it was documented, it was just a wonderful time, because he never talked about it. And I suddenly realized, oh my God, he really did do something. He wasn't just this kind old absent-minded grandfather. But he was proud of it, but you had to force it out of him, because he wouldn't brag. If anything, my grandfather would poke fun at himself. But it was a big deal. By 1941, before the war even started, we had 16 shipyards with planned expansion to 70, which, considering it was 6, we were no longer dependent on foreign shipping. We were past that, but we were mass producing these Liberty ships, which Roosevelt called the Ugly Ducklings. There's the first one being launched right there. And my grandfather, of course, loving Maryland, made sure that it was being launched at Veterans
And
Deal.
these shipyards weren't government shipyards, they were privately owned
Correct.
shipyards. right?
Correct.
Why
So-
would they call it ugly ducklings?
Because they were a mass-produced ship. Actually, you can't see it from here. I guess the people that were in the merchant marine business thought they were smaller, they were faster, they weren't.
They were built for city.
They were built to. I'm totally unqualified to just say what a ship should look like. But the people in the shipping world thought so. But anyway, they were mass producing them, and then they went to another version in 1943. But we produced 5,500 ships by the end of the war, which just, once again made a huge difference. I just often think, if that bill had been 2 or 3 years later going through, it might have made a significant difference in the war. We definitely would have had some difficulties. My grandfather made a lot of trips to the White House to see Roosevelt, and terrapin soup was his ticket. Roosevelt apparently loved terrapin soup. I guess he had it when he was down at Spocott. My grandpa, terrapin, of course, is Maryland state turtle, and it's the one saltwater turtle that we have in the bay. But the Roosevelt apparently loved it, and my grandfather, even when he and Roosevelt, you will see, didn't get along so well, if my grandmother had terrapin soup, he was welcome in the White House. So he kind of used that as his ticket to get in. Spent a lot of time in the White House on personal basis as well as sometimes on business. However, things have really ramped up between the two of them. By the way, the picture of Roosevelt that's there, you'll actually see that portrait when you go through Spocott. That was a gift from Roosevelt to my grandfather. We're not really sure what to do with it. I'm sure it's got some value to it, but to us it's more personal. My grandfather's been the New Dealer, but his fiscal conservatism starting to kick in. And when Roosevelt tried to pack the Supreme Court, if you know the basis behind that, the courts weren't always ruling in favor of a lot of his alphabet programs in 36. And so Roosevelt's idea was for every justice that was over 70, you could appoint one more justice up to 15. And of course, he would make sure that the ones that were appointed would be in favor of the New Deal programs. He immediately assumed my grandfather would support it. And there, in my grandfather's writing, there are numerous times that he was invited to the White House. Roosevelt, my grandfather was sort of considered a key senator there. Having been a friend, if a friend of Roosevelt wasn't going to support that bill, it probably was going to lose some Democratic support. What my grandfather did is offer a compromise. I don't know what the compromise was, but he offered a compromise and said that, he would be in favor of that. But he also refused to take a position. And this characterized my grandfather and drove a lot of people crazy in the Senate. My grandfather's way of dealing with a political bill is to withhold judgment until you do all the facts. Makes perfect sense. However, not often what happens today. And my grandfather would go back and he would research it and he'd listen to both sides, and then at the last minute he would decide what his position was. So he withheld opinion on it, but obviously Roosevelt thought there was a chance he could vote against it. And in fact, he did oppose and was one of the ones that voted against the Supreme Court packing, which of course didn't pass. What really caused a rift between the two, and it personally broke them up for a period of time. In 1938, I don't know if there's a separate slide on that or whether it's covered here. Yeah, in 1938, the other Maryland Senator, Millard Tidings, I can't believe I want to say Millard Fillmore, was the senior senator, much more conservative than my grandfather, voted against many of the alphabet bills. And Roosevelt set out in 1938 to basically rid the Senate of any conservative Democrats. And he very much actively campaigned to get Millard Tidings kicked out of office. My grandfather and Tidings did not agree. My grandfather, the closest he ever came to being negative, I did find a letter that he wrote to someone where he did refer to Tidings as sometimes arrogant. That's probably the closest I ever found to him saying something negative. And yet, and yet they respected each other. And Tidings asked my grandfather to not just support him, but to run his campaign. Almost unheard of that one senator would be the campaign manager for another senator. My grandfather was all about Maryland came first. Maryland came before everything. And against his friend Roosevelt's advice, my grandfather took on the job of running Tidings' campaign. Tidings was reelected, but Roosevelt was absolutely furious with my grandfather that he would do that. But state to my grandfather came before friendship.
Was that because he didn't see anyone who would be better than Tidings?
Well, he respected Tidings. he thought that he knew Tidings was an intelligent man. He was experienced. He was on a number of key committees, and just felt that he had earned the respect. And my grandfather, as you're going to see, was really about as nonpartisan as you could be. He just didn't, he just didn't get into party at all. When he became United States Senator, Maryland wanted to make him the Democratic Party boss of Maryland, which I guess most politicians would love to be. My grandfather wanted nothing to do with it. He said, and he really was trying to be as apolitical as possible. But he just felt the man deserved respect, that it just would be, it would cause conflict in Maryland, and he just thought this was the way to go about it. And, I respect him for that. Roosevelt obviously wasn't real happy with it. But that really caused a minor breakup between the two that really went on for a couple of years. My grandfather was perceived of initially as a liberal, even though he really wasn't. And some of his conservative side started coming out. He clearly was voting pro-Democrat or pro-liberal on some issues, but he just felt that with the Depression sort of behind in the distance, it was no longer an emergency, and it was time to think about balancing budgets and whatnot, rather than just spending. And also with a war coming, he also saw that this isn't a good time to be in debt. Just let's start being a little bit more conservative, because we're going to need, the military's going to need some significant money, which of course they did. Interestingly enough, one of the bills that he continued to support was building the Chesapeake Bay Bridge. He was pushing the Chesapeake Bay Bridge in the Senate all through the 30s. And it would have been, if not for World War II, it would have been built long before it was, because he had it close to being funded in the late 30s. And the war sort of put an end to that. We'll talk about this a little bit more when we get to race issue. One of his fellow senators was Hugo Black. You may be familiar with that name. This is a senator from Alabama, and he was appointed in 37 by Roosevelt to be on the Supreme Court. It came out after Roosevelt had nominated him that Black had been a member of the Ku Klux Klan. And that caused a real storm of controversy. He had resigned long before this, but in today's world, he would have immediately been tossed out. But back then, the thinking was, it's in the past, we'll let it be. My grandfather was criticized significantly by factions in the state, but he supported his nomination. He felt he was a good man and felt would make a good justice. And that was in the past. And ironically, Hugo Black ended up becoming one of the more progressive Supreme Court justices that we had. So he clearly left his past behind, but it caused for some friction in the state, some of which I think you'll see backfired a little later on. And it's about time to wrap up. Let me just see where we are. Almost done it. Yeah, the packing of the Supreme Court, I think we talked about. My grandfather, and I'm going to end with this. My grandfather just always thought Roosevelt was a remarkable man. This story comes from my father. This is an invitation given to my grandfather. It was given to my grandfather for a big event at the White House. My grandfather was abroad, I think, at the time, and called the White House and talked to the White House staff and said, I'll send my son instead, his son being about 19 years old. Roosevelt had no idea that my father, an 18-year-old, was going to be there. Now, he had met my father before. He had met my father on 2 occasions when my father was a young child at Spocott. but one changes a lot from age 8 to age 19. My father said he remembered walking in the room, could see that Roosevelt on the other side of the room. Roosevelt immediately just did a double take, came over to see my father, put his arm around him and said, "George, it's so great to see you again." And my grandfather said Roosevelt had the most amazing memory of anyone he ever encountered. The fact that not knowing my father was coming and to recognize him 11 years later in a crowded room, he said that just showed the
Did he
kind
look
of man
very
he
much
was.
like your grandfather? Did he resemble your grandfather?
Not at age 19, because at that point, my grandfather well, actually, when Roosevelt met my grandfather, he was already well into his 40s. Actually, 50s. 21, or no, 17, yeah, he would have been 40 years old when my grandfather first met Roosevelt. But it just absolutely blew my father away that, and the stories my grandfather had of Roosevelt's memory. And they said that's one of the reasons he was political. Or so successful politically, he never forgot a face.
And the name to go with it.
I am the complete opposite.
Yeah.
Who are you? Name tags don't even help me.
Yeah.
Anyway, this is sort of the end of this, but we can wrap this up quickly. There are a couple things, and then get into the race side of it, which is, I think, will be kind of fun because you'll be just as capable as I am of coming up with some conclusions in that, because being born right after the Civil War in a Confederate family, and then living to 1974 after the race riots and civil rights legislation, he saw an incredible change in the country. And yet never once did I ever hear him voice an opinion as to how he felt about race relationships or race. He never said a word. So I honestly have no clue how he felt. So what we'll do is we'll look at events and actions in his life and sort of let you all kind of come up with it. I think it'll be kind of fun. Anyway, that's a good place to leave off today.